Hi.
Hey, Sarah. How you
How's it?
doing?
Mm. Trying to see if you can see
Yeah.
behind the.
Oh, it's so pretty.
Yes.
I love that tree that you've got in that space too. Just like I feel like we've had a couple of chats with you under that tree, and it's even that is just very nice to look at.
Yeah, all of the courtyards in the barracks have these
Okay.
kind of probably 4 or 5 species of trees.
Oh, nice. Well, I am here on my balcony with my big giant pine tree right behind me.
Oh yeah,
Um,
speak of that tree. Is it warmer? It's warmer everywhere.
It is warmer, although it's chill. It's a little bit chilly today. I've still got my little coat on. I mean, it's very sunny and beautiful, but it feels like an early spring day rather than, you know, something. I don't know what maybe it's mid 60s. So,
4% humidity here.
oh God.
This is like, you know, Venusian. Venus is supposedly the hottest, driest planet.
Okay.
We're in actually, though, the breeze is cool, so it's nice. I'm glad we're outside again.
I know. I feel like it's like when the sun keeps coming out from behind clouds
Mhm.
here, and when the sun comes out, it's so warm on my shoulders, and then when
Yeah.
the sun hides away, it gets chilly again. Well, for the folks tuning in, we are doing a kind of live recording of a conversation that Sahra and I tried to have a little while ago, and we had some technical difficulties, but the ideas were really good, and so we still wanted to share the ideas and have the conversation.
Cell
Um,
phone station.
exactly. So we're doing this from my account, and then it's going to be shared on the Aspen Art Museum account in a bit. But I will say I'm Rachel Ropeik. I'm the learning director at the Aspen Art Museum. So I am here in Aspen, Colorado, and I'm joined with her glamorous sunglasses and red lipstick, and in beautiful Marfa, Texas, um,
Sure.
by Sahra Motalebi, who is, among other things, the artist in residence at the Chinati Foundation in Marfa, an extended residency, shall we say.
Yeah.
um,
I one could hope perpetually, but
yeah. And we have just been having some really interesting conversations about kind of how place and our different locations are sort of impacting us right now. And Sahra, and we'll get into this in conversation, but Sahra had a piece of work that was intended to be kind of a, multimedia installation, performance, sculpture, all of the above, and that has really shifted due to quarantine and COVID-19. Um, but I guess maybe that's kind of the first topic that I want to ask you about, Sahra, is sort of how has being isolated in this place for a longer period of time than you expected to be there kind of impacted how you've been thinking about your own work? Because Marfa is not your home base generally.
yeah. Well, I think this isolation here, this quarantine here, the oh,
Sorry.
because I actually live in rural upstate New York, but I think to talk a little bit about how that isolation relates to Cincinnati in particular is kind of interesting. I mean, I obviously a lot has evolved in the last couple of months, and I arrived in the last couple of days of February. So, you know, what I experienced here was kind of a infinite regress of I 3 hours from El Paso. Um, Now Texas is actually looking toward reopening. So the whole phenomenal experience of being far from home, but also in a place where I had a great privilege of the landscape has shifted. Um, and is, as we know, it's kind of a dramatic, chaotic thing to come back online. But isolation, you know, it echoed in my conception about the work, because it sort of amplified and, I would say, iterated the work in kind of uncanny way. And that obviously had to do with the very shared global experience of isolation, right? So we talked about last time what that isolation is comprised of, and I think it's physical location, of course. So for me, it's in this extreme landscape, which you cannot see because there is no nor internet. So it's a physical location, but it's also, and I think about this as someone who uses my body in my work, but it's a lot about, I think, the shared experience, at least, for those of us who can connect, is about our bodies. So in the material realm, that also includes our health, you know, whatever that means, and really at the kind of level of the corporeal. So I have felt that the larger body of work, which we can talk about, is like just what I needed to kind of cope, I think, with isolation, and also with very unforeseen, very strange circumstances. So, you know, that geography, considering geography, I think for as a human being, but also as an artist, was also, I mean, we have been, as I've said, like thrust more thoroughly into the screenome. And that screenome is, you know, that is where you are in the timeline, where you are in the global internet, but also like where your attention span is, right? So sense of isolation is manifold, I would think, for most people.
And you also, I mean, I feel like that also connects to the way that you're thinking about like the imaginal and the imaginary as coming into your work, where there's a certain part of that you're inviting people to be thinking about your work and imagining elements of your work to sort of finish the piece or create the piece in their own heads, right? So you're, you know, this series, this Resonators project that you were doing at Shinati, it was part of it was getting people to imagine how these kind of sculptural instruments might sound if they were played, right? It wasn't just about creating an actual audio.
Yeah, the Resonators, okay, so this larger body of work, I mean, the Resonators they're a suite of instruments. I'm calling them instruments. And they're, you know, the body of work that I'm specifically working on, it includes a couple of projects. Resonators is the project that I'm involved with here. These instruments are representative of that body of work because the broader vibe, I would say, the broader polemic, if you will, is both of those things, is about the effects of digitality on creative utterance and specifically performance, but, you know, the textual, the material, and, you know, I think the opportunity for interdisciplinary work, pretty much. And this also includes a project called Phenomenal Overlay, which is actually a couple of years old. And that's also about like the dematerialization of architecture, you know, conceived in the context of the Glass House in Connecticut. So the last 2 months, as I said, have like kind of amplified and recontextualized the work. I think made it more meaningful in many ways. And isolation is a part of that. And I'll get back to the landscape itself here. But the physical manifestation of the work was really supposed to be born here, right? So, and that makes a lot of sense in the context of Judd's oeuvre and also Chinati. But the instruments are like these kind of speculative prototypes. They're sound sculptures essentially, but they're prompts for experience. They also involve texts and scores, and they're basically drawn formally, and also from the point of view of sound, algorithmically. They're drawn from the worlds of geology, computational science, and music, because I think the context of tools and instruments being a tool, we're all kind of converging in an idea of the suite. So the suite is like a iterative, or like almost like a grouping, a permutational grouping. So the instruments, there's like 5 of them. Now I'm focusing more on like 3, but they're essentially maquettes with a sound installation. So, you know, they take their production into play. So the text along with them is sort of a reflection on the potential for them to exist, you know, and especially now in this world. They're like invoking like imaginal spaces of the haptic, you know, having to do with touch, but also, which is obviously like specifically verboten right now in public space, but sound and sight. And it's almost as if, and I can get into this, they're not like futuristic per se, but they're almost from like another world, perhaps hidden away. And they, you know, they're like I called them, it's like a taxonomy of playthings, really. So that involves a lot of different elements of my practice.
Yeah, but I do think there's something really interesting about that, where like even before quarantine and self-isolation and social distancing and all of that came about, I feel like this thread of your work, where it's like so much about it is each person's individual, you know, creative, playful imaginings are kind of invoked, right? And that's an important thing.
Yeah.
Kind of realize these works. And I do feel like there's something interesting about that, where like now we're in this place where, you know, for public health reasons, we also need to be isolating physically, but also that it's not just about like a limitation in that isolation. Like there's also something in the imaginative freedom.
Yeah, also visionary in that way. I mean, not visionary in the sense of grandeur, but visionary in the sense of like alternative realities, or yeah. And I, you know, that I loved like our conversation last time, kind of, you know, I wrote down some notes because it was like very succinct what you drew out. I think like specifically, just to go back a little bit about this location, the location really helped me like midwife that imaginal realm, because I mean, you can't see it really. There were images, and of course there were some in Aspen's like stories and stuff, but there is a almost, I would say, I mean, the landscape is very extreme. So, and you know that Judd experienced that when he came through here in the early 70s, and he was like, I'm staying here. The high desert plateau, if you look out, is like really wild. I mean, your senses almost kind of lay down, I would say. There's like a synchrony there. And then, and then of course, like a total, almost, it's like an expansiveness that feels like synesthetic, right? So that actually helped with the conception of the work. And you know, I could say a lot about what is out in that landscape. There's Judd's 15 works in concrete from 80 to 84, and it does something very strange. You're looking at the landscape, and the size, which is quite big, they're 8 by 8 by 16, looks almost like dioramic from this from here, but you walk down in it. So I was able to kind of scale jump in a way, a material jump, which was really cool. So, but about the imaginal realm, I mean, if you do interdisciplinary practice, you're kind of forced into the imaginal realm. One hopes happily, and the participants or viewers or audience or how, you know, viewers they are also, they join you there. It's a co-creative process, I would say. And so I've been thinking about that for a long time, right? So this question of, and it is a theme, but like translation at this moment, it works. I mean, it's the open format project that I usually work in is across media and formats. So it's like a total work that comes together.
And it's funny because we're almost, it's like, I sort of think about how we're having to live now. Like we're in these kind of hybrid spaces of like physical, you know, like you and I are talking right now, and I can see your face and you can see my face and we can hear each other's voices. But we're not physically in the same space, and it's only the digital realm that's letting us kind of bridge that gap. And so what is that hybrid of like these communities that are being formed in the digital realm?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the imaginative, the imaginal realm in particular, in my work and in resonators, I think the presumption is that it's immersive, but of course now what you're talking about is a projective space. And I think this is where, you know, this is where I think the function of like storytelling work to, I would say bridge us. I mean, you know, I'm certainly one who believes in storytelling as like a function of our humanness, and that also includes those things that are nonlinear and disjunctive. And I again, I said this last time, but I think it's arguably the more disjunctive, the richer the picture, right? So it doesn't matter if it's non-narrative, so to speak. But I also think that that kind of imaginal space, the projective space, is one of the spirit, and I think that that's really about how one can kind of conjure limitless futures, you know, so emergent potentials in art. So yeah, I think also we were talking about calamity, and I brought up how play had specifically functioned in my early choices around scenography and mise en scène and like stage sets, like my background in architecture, how specifically I had wanted to set up these places where stories could take place. And after all, involves things that, like now, we, at the scale in which this is operating, it's not exactly something, and the most aspects of what we're living through right now are not things one necessarily is sanguine about. So I think the imaginal realm offers a place where even those complexities, it allows us to kind of have art hold those complexities specifically.
Yeah. And that's sort of like the power of what makes it sort of immersive and inviting and expansive as well.
I mean, it's not the first time, obviously, that, again, to go back to the notion of play, it's like, well, play in the sense of maybe perhaps like healing.
Yeah.
The way that the cinegraphic has worked, or the way that the material and the expressive, or, you know, these kind of dichotomies that we discussed that I'm sure you'll bring up, the way that those have worked in the past have always been around like material culture wise, where kind of circumstances collided with means, right?
Yeah. Well,
but also Europe, like.
Yeah. Well, and that, I mean, we've also talked a little bit about like, what does that mean when it's people don't have the means or the access to, you know, right now it may be a digital access situation. Maybe in other times it's are physically distant from being able to participate in an art installation or an art happening, or, you know, it's sort of like all these different realms that people operate in, whether it's physical or digital or imaginal, you know.
Yeah, I think digital space is, well, you know, about access. You asked me last time about, I thought that was an interesting way of putting it. It's like the success and the failure of how digital space and like physical space meet, and I, you know, or sort of how we're forced to reckon with that, right? So, and then access is an aspect of that, and I thought that's obviously something everyone has been thinking about, especially with family and friends, and myself here, like last time, when the conditions and the like tenuousness of connectivity are like so apparent, you know, globally. And for artists, I think that digital space has long been of interest. The production of images, how we are sort of marrying the digital realm. So like, that's nothing new. I do think the determination of any artist's like velocity, I guess you would say, or has been measured like around a certain kind of idea of success or reach or something. I mean, you know, we're all very much involved in like a future jumping, almost like an archaeology of our own digital work. So like, you know, and how our work is online. So with that in mind, I think what's marked for me is that there seems to be a lot of interest in kind of the ephemeral feel, the improvisational feel of things right now. It's like both media and text, I feel like, as someone who works in the performative realm, you know, I take for granted that most things are performative, right? So, you know, the emphasis on naturalism and like economy of means and stuff is fascinating, right? But also, we don't know what the future looks like. Like as I said to you, I talked to the archivist here. Her name is Hannah Marshall. We had a good long chat about that, and was particularly struck by. And obviously, we're moving back into reopening, but and that we can talk about what that means for like public space. But in terms of output, it does seem a signal to noise ratio kind of issue. And this is interesting.
And it's funny too, because we're also having those same conversations about, you know, reopening the museum as a space, but are we going to keep going with some of the digital programming that we've done, you know, like these kinds of conversations for people who aren't physically nearby? Because I think one thing we've found, back to that idea of like success and failure, it's like, you know, there's no right or wrong answer, right? So there are some experiences that you can only have when you're physically in the presence of an object or a performance, or you're sharing space with people physically. But then also these digital modes that we've been working in have allowed us to sort of reach out and connect with people who are more physically distant, or who might not be interested in going to an art space physically, but are on Instagram and see someone's going live and can join in and watch, right? So it is, I feel like there is that, it's like, how do we move forward, bridging that gap of the physical and the digital when we do start to have the options? Because Colorado is also one of the states that's thinking about, you know, how do we relax some of these regulations? And I don't know the answer to that, but
experiment.
Yes, a grand experiment that we're all a part of.
That's
but I do want to bring back one thing that you had said before about on the physical spaces front, with those mixed emotions, because I really liked that you were thinking about. I wrote down the quote that you said about it. That was thinking about all of these spaces that have been closed, that are mostly still closed. These art spaces, galleries, museums, theaters, that sort of thing. But I really liked the way that you talked about them. You said, here's your quote, that they're nebulous, the nebulous, problematic, miraculous things that emerge from art, the relationships between the physical and the emotional, the formal and the expressive. And I feel like that idea of these spaces being closed, but that those spaces are not always like, you know, you don't always go to a museum and feel wonderful and happy. Like sometimes the art is disturbing to you, or sometimes it's scary, or sometimes you don't like it, right? Or a theater, like a performance piece especially, it's going to bring up these strong emotions that may be in a number of different ways. And
I mean, what's interesting is that people, I mean, I have had a lot of queries because people who do performance-based work or interdisciplinary work are thought at this moment to be people who might be able to traverse this kind of territory with a sort of flexibility. And I would say, with regard to what is kind of primary to my practice, the joke is like, I definitely traffic in expressivity, and I do think that coming through the screen is possible. But, you know, if you consider the public realm, I mean, is a place where I would say, you know, with an audience, with collaborators, all these things where a conversation can happen. It was a pretty intense shutdown, right? So for anyone who, obviously many people, and there are many people all over the world living in all manner of dire circumstances. And so I'm speaking specifically about people that are thinking through artistic practice in addition to whatever other circumstances they're facing, which as we discussed, has to do with physical location and the geographical, but that also includes like material and economic circumstances. So I want to be clear about that. But institutions are usually places where the non-material or durational or the performative, however one kind of demarcates these things, where they're sort of played out in an experimental level and produced for, I would say, hopefully dialogue with not only the public, but other artists. And this is about, at its heart, I think, about communion, and I think it's about participation, but it's mostly about experientiality, right? So when we talk through a reformulation of that, we include the critique, we include all manner of like investigations and spectacle and various rhetorics around this, you know, and some of that I think has been made more important, and some of it has been completely, it's like kind of rendered obsolete. So I think, far be it from me to opine about like the life of institutions. I think I really, from the last time we spoke, couldn't say much more about that, even as we look toward kind of what it would be like to have a more hybrid situation as we move back into like the social sphere or whatever. But performance work, durational work, was already in a kind of precarious situation, I would say. And so I
mean,
around it are ones that I think essentially happen in a public sphere, and then that's also like generative. And I think that the feedback loop, as we're sort of accelerating to the digital realm, is like obviously one, again, about means and economy, but it's also about a kind of quick metabolism of those conversations. So maybe life returns to normal, maybe institutional or like work in the public realm changes forever. We don't know.
I mean, and I think that's been really interesting to see even how quickly those conversations have developed about what a return to normal might look like, or whether we'll ever have that, or what version of that we'll have as institutions, as public spaces, as places where people can just gather in groups. I mean, I do think that I think the thing I keep being very curious about is, you know, like 5 years from now, when we look back at this moment, like what will the will the feeling be, or what will the conditions and the norms for art presentations and performance be?
Yeah, I've yet to see how things like, I'm just speaking architecturally in some ways, but I'm also talking about like sort of the political and ideological kind of aspects of this, but, you know, requirements and regulations, and specifically as it relates to density, safety, labor, all of that. I mean, I'd be very interested to know. It's like, I'm thinking of one building I know, like a very old building in Europe that is actually questions about air circulation and an intervention of the building are being required for, just from the point of view of like filtration and HEPA filters and stuff. I mean, that will be a very specific kind of sustainability for people, and a kind of whatever cash outlay is required to make those things possible so people can open their doors again, right? I mean, I think there's been this whole I would say network of conversations in the art world around globality as it relates to the internet in this moment. And I honestly wonder what notions of community and institutionality, what, you know, when we see how actually quite vulnerable these things are. And I think rethinking them is going to be an aspect of everyone's, like, you know, obviously survival, but, you know, how people can thrive.
Yeah.
If they were before, right?
do think it's going to be some of the places that are open to changing their models and changing how they reopen and think.
Yeah, reformatting display and an exhibition and everything, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I will say, even just like since the last time you and I spoke, we're having some conversations about programming in the museum where, you know, maybe what we do whenever we're first able to reopen, which we don't know when that is yet, but you know, maybe the first things that we're offering is, you know, the museum can be a place where people can come and pick up ideas to take with them, or prompts, or, you know, guides around the galleries, but we're not offering group gathering programs.
Yeah, and I think also, like, I was speaking to a curator this morning around a project that was intended for a space that it is unbelievably dry. I just can't even tell you. It's not even that hot. It's just this curator and I were speaking about this project space, you know, because Resonators had 3 incarnations for exhibition this year. So and you asked me last time about where I said I don't have any contingency plans. It's just about muting or transposing things, and I feel pretty good about that. I mean, aside from the heartbreak around the whole situation in general, of the globe, you know, family and friends in Europe and in the Middle East and in the United States, obviously. But we were talking about
sorry,
I can take my son. No.
I'm getting all the wind. You're getting the sun and the heat. I'm getting the wind.
Yeah, we were talking about what would it be like if you just had a series of smaller indoor outdoor things, you know? And I've had the fortune here of not having that binary of indoor outdoor. I've had like a fluid kind of access to the landscape and stuff, and I'm you know, every day wake up like kind of stunned by that fortuity, I guess you could say. But and this curator and I essentially were like, we have to play it as it lays. We, you know, there's no telling, especially as winter and fall kick in the East Coast of the United States. But the feeling is one of kind of hopefully optimism, I would say.
And but I do think the flexibility that has come out of this from, you know, from artists, from art workers, from institutions, like in different ways, I think that has been something that I at least have taken a lot of hope from.
Mm-hmm.
That I think there are places and people who will be able to pivot and think in new ways about what reopening might look like, about what an indoor outdoor installation might look like, right? You know, what projects might look like that live physically and or digitally in different ways. And I do think I'm really interested to see where that creativity leads. I don't think it's going to be true for everywhere and everyone.
No, it's certainly true before. So I mean, in terms of like that's what's so interesting to me is like depending on where you live in the world, you know, these questions of access and isolation, I mean, and also sort of lockdown and these various forms of kind of like the ways that our experience is being controlled is not a new scenario, right? So we can have ultimately, I think, like a truly more global kind of understanding of what not just us in these kind of major cities or something in the US are experiencing, but we're kind of at a baseline for the most primary elements of sociality and humanity in terms of like physical human contact. So maybe that hopefully kind of, and also like obviously safe conditions, this becomes an incredibly critical inflection point, I think.
And I do think it's going to be artists and performers and creative people who are able to kind of harness the sort of new thinking around that and share it in a way that's easier than, you know, it's like we can't know what's going to happen, right? But I think people
data, it seems, or the news. So
yeah, I mean, but I think, you know, it's like being able to think about like how imagination plays into work and how communities can form across these sort of physical and digital divides, and how creative practice can grow and change, and like
it's that it's also that, and then also critical for understanding our like very real limitations imposed, and for various reasons. So it's both, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe that is like a slightly hopeful note to to wrap on.
Yeah, a complex note. A complex.
Exactly. Well, it's like a question mark, but with maybe a positive inflection to it.
Great to speak with you again. I can't wait to come up to Aspen.
Oh my God, same. I would love to. I mean, at some point we'll meet in the physical realm.
Yep.
And just for computers and devices.
Yeah, that probably would involve our animal friends in this region.
Yes.
Snakes,
Oh my God.
Scorpions. So, thank you so much for your attention to this project, and also for the connection.
I right back at you. Thank you for joining in on these conversations. I feel like these have been some really like rich and fruitful ideas, and they've definitely given me good food for thought and hope for the future. You know, things are depressing and also hopeful at the same time.
Well, the future's coming faster than we perhaps are have been used to the last couple of months. So stay well.